As parents and educators and advocates, we often talk about LRE, the least restrictive environment, without really thinking about the ways that LRE has been used against our students. So today we're going to be talking about 6 flaws of LRE and some steps that you can take to create more systemic change. If you're new to our show, I'm Charmaine Tanner. I'm a parent, a retired teacher, a full-time advocate for students, and I support parents as they advocate for inclusive education for their children. Um, and we also are here every Thursday. I host this Art of Advocacy show, and today is your lucky day because you're going to be hearing from Dr. Cheryl Jorgensen, and she is going to be sharing her insights about LREA. LRE, if I get my acronyms right. The other thing I wanted to say is we're going to have a book giveaway because we haven't done that in a while. So you will have a choice if you are our lucky winner. You can win either the Beyond Access model that Dr. Jorgensen has written or her book. That's the Beyond Access. This is her other book. It's more than just being in. So the way that you win a book giveaway is by typing in comments and questions, being actively engaged, because at the end of the show, hopefully I'll remember, I'll scroll through the comments and pick a lucky winner, and you can choose which book you would like. So we are going to bring on our guest, and I'm going to give a short introduction to Dr. Jorgensen. And we were just chatting before the show. This is the first time we've ever met, which we can't believe that our paths haven't crossed in person. But in 1993, there was this wonderful book that Dr. Jorgensen co-authored called Changes in Latitudes, Changes in Attitudes. And it was for the role of the inclusion facilitator. And when I was looking at this morning, I thought, this book was written in 1993, and it's still so appropriate today. Which means we've worked for a number of years and we're still working and we have more work to do, right? The other book that I just love, these are like precious gifts, is From Special to Regular, From Ordinary to Extraordinary. And both of these books were written when Dr. Jorgensen was at the University of New Hampshire, and she was the co-founder. I need to make sure I get this right. Co-founder of the Center for Inclusive Education at the Institute on Disability at the University of New Hampshire. Now, you might have heard Cheryl at a national conference because she's a frequent speaker there, or in other ways. She has been in the field of inclusive education and leading that movement for 35 years. She's been a policy analyst. She's provided professional development and technical assistance to school districts, a university professor. She's served on many different work groups at the U.S. Department of Education. So I am just thrilled. I know people are looking forward to your talk today, Cheryl, about those flaws of LRE. So welcome, Cheryl. And if you want to tell us a bit about the work that you're doing now and why LRE is such a favorite topic for you to speak about.
Thanks very much. Oh, it's fun being on this show. I'm not keeping up with all the comments and people I recognize, but hi, those of you who I've chatted with before. It's 11 years ago, 10, 11 years ago, I decided to leave the university to spend more time with my grandkids. In 2011, I started a private consulting business, and that's what I've been doing ever since. Although I still do some conference presentations, write the occasional book. I have done a couple of summer institutes for school districts. So I'm semi-retired, I like to say.
Well, we're glad that you're still out there.
Thank you. And as to why LRE and least restrictive environment is a passion of mine, it's because I've been in so many IEP meetings where I think the principle is really, it's being misused. It's not well understood. And I see parents and educators who may want to might want to include students in general ed, but the LRE principle, it just stands in their way. So a couple of years ago, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago, um, a group of us who were attending the TASH conference, used to have a real acronym, but now it's just TASH, sat around and were like, okay, many of us have been doing this inclusive ed work for over 30 years. Why are we not making a meaningful impact? What's really at the root of keeping kids out of general ed? And so one of those colleagues, Janet Sauer from Lesley University, and I decided that we were going to write a paper about what we think is one of the root causes of keeping kids out of general ed. And that is that we think, and we're not the first people to have thought of this, but think that the whole principle, the underlying assumptions of that LRE principle are really flawed. So we wrote the paper, it got published in a journal, and I'm still not seeing significant movement of students, particularly those with intellectual disability labels, from self-contained to more inclusive classrooms. So it's an ongoing frustration.
Oh, I know. And yeah, and it is hard. And I think, sometimes we think when we're advocating, oh, but we have the least restrictive environment, but we don't really understand how that whole concept has really been a barrier. So I'll pull up your slides, and if you want to start, then I think that would be a great way for people to start kind of getting the context of this, the LRE principle.
Yeah. And to respond to one person's question, you are recording this,
Yes.
Charmaine, and
Yes.
it will be available for viewing later.
Yeah, right. As soon as we stop, it will go up on Facebook, and then I'll also put it on my YouTube channel. But yeah, for sure, people can come back right here on Facebook and see it for
Yeah,
replay.
and so those of you who are listening don't have to take copious notes. There are a couple of slides that have a lot of information on them, so don't worry if you don't catch them this first time through. You can get them later.
Right.
So it makes sense to define what is least restrictive environment. So I went back to the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, the most recent version of it, which is still quite old, 2004. And if you skip down to about the third bullet point, this gets into the real meat of the definition. So each public agency, schools, state departments of education, must ensure that to the maximum extent appropriate, and that's an important word, children with disabilities, including children in public or private institutions or other care facilities, are educated with children who are non-disabled, and special classes, separate schooling, or other removal of children with disabilities from the regular education environment occurs only if the nature and severity of the disability is such that education, with the use of supplementary aids and services in regular classes, cannot be achieved satisfactorily. So there are lots of words in here that are open to lots of interpretation. So the phrase maximum extent appropriate. Who defines maximum extent? Who defines appropriate? Um, who defines severity of the disability? Who defines satisfactorily? So least restrictive environment, and I think that some of the people that originally wrote the special ed law wanted to leave a lot of flexibility for local IEP teams to determine for each individual student what his or her least restrictive environment is. And therein, I wish that were a strength of the principle, because of course we want all children to be treated individually, and we understand, no one size fits all. But I think that the ambiguities in the principle and in the law, in addition to some other factors, are what's stalling out our movements toward inclusive education. So let me go on to the next slide, and I guess offer you some some proof, some evidence that the LRE principle, which is often confused with inclusion, how the LRE principle um, has not, in and of itself, in the way it's been utilized, resulted in more students with more significant disabilities spending more time in general education. It's a lot of mores there. So we've got some charts and graphs up here. This one is from the National Center for Education Statistics, and I used the red box and the arrow to point to this 64%. And that means that within the last, data from the last couple of years, about 64% of all students with disabilities are spending 80% or more of their day in general education. Some states have actually defined inclusion as being 80% or more of the time in general education. Other states have not done that. However, when you drill down into some of the individual disability categories, and for our purposes today, that is students who have a label of intellectual disability, you can see that only 17.3% of those students, and this is nationwide, are spending 80% or more of their day in general education. Why is that? Why is that? And I ask, why is that? Because that very same law, IDEA, that defines least restrictive environment, says almost 30 years of research and experience has demonstrated that the education of children with disabilities can be made more effective by, and then it lists a lot of things, including ensuring their access to the general ed curriculum in the regular classroom to the maximum extent possible. Now, it's always been very interesting to me, and I probably need to talk to some legal expert about why in the introductory paragraphs of IDEA, the phrase is maximum extent possible. But later on in the law, when they start to actually define LRE, which is um, reflected in sort of a continuum of alternate placements, why they use the term maximum extent appropriate. For whatever reason, that's one of the reasons that we haven't seen more movement. Charmaine, do you want to jump in here? to make a comment, ask questions. I have not been doing a very good job, in fact, of looking at these chats because they're
No,
going,
you're doing fine. I think
they're going so quickly.
Jennifer has a good comment, and I don't know if we want to save a response to it later, but
Okay.
this is something that I hear a lot is, she said, I'm told my son is falling too behind in co-teaching, the co-taught classes and needs resource. So somewhere along the line today, if we can look at, yeah, that is so common. And instead of changing what happens in the general ed classroom and the support, almost kind of the immediate knee-jerk reaction is we need to pull this kid out and give him more time in the resource room.
Yeah, exactly. I will have more to say about this a little bit later, but I want to remind folks that spelled out in the regulations that govern the implementation of IDEA is a really important phrase. And that phrase is the need for curriculum modification cannot be used as the sole reason to exclude a student from general education. A lot of people they're floored by that statement. They can't believe it exists because families have heard it so often. Sometimes they're being told the gap is getting so much bigger, your child can't keep up, the curriculum is too hard. So I would encourage you all to, pop up your internet browser and look for that phrase in IDEA and carry it with you when you go into IEP meetings. Again, I will say something a little bit more about that in just a bit.
And I'll just say that if people aren't signed up to get my emails, tomorrow I'll be sending out an email with some of the resources that Cheryl is mentioning today. So if you're not on, you can sign up at iep.today/weekly ad tips, but we'll be sending out some of these specific resources that Cheryl's referring to. So thank you.
That's great. I'm going to go kind of quickly through these next few slides because I think those of you that are participating today probably are fully aware that there is a lot of research showing that students with disabilities and students without disabilities have improved educational outcomes and improved post-school outcomes compared to students who are educated primarily in self-contained classes. So these are some of these slides that you can kind of take notes on or grab screenshots of later. But we know that some of the benefits for students with disabilities is higher expectations when they're included in general ed, greater engagement with instruction, improved communication and social skills, more diverse social relationships, greater access to the general ed curriculum taught by general ed curriculum content experts, who are those general ed teachers, actually higher scores on some standardized achievement tests. And the last one I'll mention specifically around the benefits for students with disabilities is improved adult outcomes. There is and this is my little visual graph here, there's a positive correlation between the amount of time students with disabilities spend in general education and improved adult outcomes in areas like how much they earn, do they even have an integrated job in the community, their level of living in non-segregated housing. So that correlation is one that has been found for all students with disabilities, including those with wicked, serious labels. So again, back to the slides. Let me skip a couple here. There's also some interesting research that shows that there are some benefits of inclusion to students without disabilities. There's been less research on that side, but the studies have found either kind of, no impact on student performance for students without disabilities or improved student performance. So when you hear the comment, oh, this student is going to bring down the scores of all our regular ed kids, you might offer some evidence to the contrary. So the big idea here of this presentation is that we believe that the segregation of students with intellectual disability results as much from the flaws in that LRE principle as it does on the attitudes and practices of people in schools. So let's dive into what we think those flaws are. And I want to really emphasize that the paper that Janet Sauer and I wrote, that's called Still Caught in the Continuum, it wasn't our original idea. Way back in 1982, a brilliant thinker named Steve. Oh, isn't that awful word finding?
Is it Taylor? Stephen Taylor?
Taylor, for heaven's sakes.
Yes.
Too bad this can't be edited. Steve Taylor from Syracuse University wrote a seminal paper called Caught in the Continuum. And he was writing not only about the continuum in education, but also in housing and employment. So anyway, Janet and I took off from his initial ideas. So flaw number one, in practice, the LRE principles the principle does not in practice ask teams to consider how maximally integrated students would be, but it asks them to really consider how segregated they should be. And underlying this is this notion that if only students were to become less disabled or to improve, they could earn their way into the next less restrictive environment. Now, those of you who work in schools, and I actually had a conversation about this with a special ed director yesterday. I said, what percentage of the time do you have students move from a self-contained classroom to a resource room or to a general ed classroom? And she said she could only think of one situation in her whole career. Even more startling is I asked her what percentage of the time students move from out of district placements, special ed out of district placements, back into home district. She said she couldn't think of a single one within the last 7 years. And to me, that is striking. And I think it's a cautionary tale for folks that once students get out, it's really hard to bring them back in.
Yeah, I think of that Michael Giangreco cartoon. I think I just posted it last week of the lobster trap.
Yeah,
You can get in, but you can't get out,
yeah, that's right. That's right. Okay, let's move on to flaw number 2. I guess it's not only the least restrictive mandate that is tied up with an idea called ableism, but it's pretty much the way society as a whole treats people with disabilities. And that is that a person with a disability, or even the idea of disability, is that it's a lesser state of being, and that there is a greater value placed on, and here are the examples. It's better for a child to walk than to use a wheelchair. It's better to speak than to sign or use an augmentative communication device. It's better to be able to read print than read braille. So it's better to not have a disabling condition than it is to have some condition that affects your functioning, but be able to use some kind of a tool or to be able to change the environment or change the instruction as a response to that difference instead of looking to change something about the person and that idea, that attitude, has been called ableism. Tom Hare, who's referenced here on the slide, has written some great papers about ableism. And some examples I can think of in recent IEP meetings that I've been to, or just doing consultations with students and families and schools, is someone will say, "Well, my child is nonverbal, but I don't want to give up the possibility of her speaking someday by giving her an augmentative communication device." Now, number one, the research shows that giving a student who doesn't speak naturally a communication device does not, in fact, reduce their ability to speak if they're going to. So, number one, that's a flawed assumption. But number two, it really says, it's just not as good for you or for the rest of us if you don't speak like the majority of people speak. Another example I've heard um, and again, kind of similar. I'm reluctant to um, ask for my child to have an evaluation to use a wheelchair because I'm afraid he'll never walk, right? Instead of thinking that so much learning, so many social relationships, so much, sort of exposure to the world could be opened up to a child if she has a wheelchair versus if she's struggling to even move. So again, ableism is inherent in LRE, and can really get in the way of people thinking more about what it would take us to change the environment so that the student would fit in that enhanced and more accessible environment rather than thinking we need to change that child.
Right.
Okay, flaw number 3. Yeah. The third flaw in the LRE mandate is evident in the prejudicial treatment of students with the intellectual disability label. If shatter the other people in the room, and folks would say, "Oh my goodness, we're not prejudiced. We have all people, educators, special educators. We're certainly not prejudiced about students with intellectual disability." But if you think about the definition of prejudice as making assumptions about an individual person based on some generalized assumptions about a group of people, then maybe you can see more how that prejudice comes into play when thinking about kids with intellectual disability. It's when, like, well, no people with Down syndrome, dot, dot, or, our experience with students, dot, dot, dot. That that sort of generalized statement about a group of people should never should be cautiously used when thinking about an individual person. I watched a very interesting documentary the other day, and I would recommend it to all of you. It's a film, I think it was on Hulu, and it's based off a book called Not Far from the Tree. And it's a book in where the author interviews parents who have a child born to them who is very different from them. Um, Parents of children with dwarfism, parents of children with autism, with Down syndrome, parents of children with different gender identities, and so on and so forth. And one of the portraits was a family who had an adult son with Down syndrome. I found myself saying to myself, wow, that guy's really smart. Look how well he uses language. He's got some great insights into himself and the world around. And I realized I was saying that because he has Down syndrome. Ah, I mean, if I'm someone who's hopefully I'm the more open and liberal thinking end of having high expectations for people with disabilities, but found myself having that prejudicial response, I realized that yes, I do have some prejudices. So anytime you as an educator, you as a parent are in an IEP meeting and you see kind of the conversation going that way, I would urge you, let's bring the discussion back to this individual person and find out what his or her strengths, gifts, and needs are. Unfortunately, the LRE principle, the law does not well enough encourage people to do that. Did you want to jump in, Charmaine?
No, that's fine. We have great conversations going on in the chat. So I
Oh,
wanted
yeah.
to let people know that about 15 minutes before the top of the hour, we'll pause and we'll take some of your questions. But yeah, keep them coming because we learn a lot from each other. So I appreciate that interaction. But
Yeah.
yeah,
Charmaine,
so we
are you muting yourself when I'm talking?
well, I somebody suggested that. So I don't know. Does that make a difference in the echo or the sound or?
It might.
Okay.
And we thought we solved the echo problem before we got on. Unfortunately, we haven't. But um, Charmaine will try and work at this behind the scenes. Okay, fourth flaw. And this really will get at many of the comments that you're making, is how decisions about LRE are oftentimes based on historical precedents in schools, how teachers have been prepared to think about students with and without disabilities, and the strength of parent advocacy and privilege. It's a very telling statistic that students of color with labels of intellectual disability are more segregated than their white classmates with similar disabilities. And this is not having anything to do with the abilities of children themselves, but rather with perhaps prejudice of a different kind, a second kind of prejudice, but also perhaps some disadvantages that some families of color have in terms of their social capital in their communities. Um, and what ends up happening, and what is so stark to me, and what I don't understand the US Department of Education doesn't try to address, is the vast geographical differences in placement for students of the same label. So if you give my cue card back up with my slide on the screen, I'll be able to give you those statistics. Yeah, so the percentages of students with IB spending more than 80% of their day in general ed goes from a low of around 4.5% in the state of Washington up to 64% in Iowa. Okay, now you cannot tell me that the students labeled with intellectual disability are that different in the state of Washington versus the state of Iowa or across all those other states as well. Some people say, oh, well, doesn't poverty have something to do with it? Look at Alabama. More than 45% of students with ID are spending more of their time in general ed in Alabama. So there must be some flaw either in the principle itself or how it's being operationalized during those IEP meetings. That is, something's going wrong. Something is not right. Um, Teams are not deliberating in the same way from team to team, school to school, district to district, state to state. And, I'm all for states' rights, but I think there needs to be a greater amount of um, more and more specific guidance um, to states about how IEP placement deliberations need to happen. I've seen some IEP forms where, it's a box. Did the team consider general ed? Check. We considered it. Did the team consider general ed with supplementary aids and services? Yep, we considered it, but we went all the way down the continuum and decided that an out of district placement is the least restrictive. On the other hand, there are some school districts that have much more elaborate instructions and have done much more professional development with their staff, so that that first consideration, which is the general ed classroom with supplementary aids and services, including perhaps paraeducators, is given enough weight, is given enough time. Um, some people think that schools are required to actually try out a gen ed classroom with supplementary aids and services before recommending a more restrictive placement. Unfortunately, that is not an assumption that's being borne out in practice. It would be great if that's what schools did, if they, you know, if we could imagine, and I'm kind of jumping ahead here into what we can do. Imagine what schools could do to promote excellence and equity if they could recapture all the money that's being spent on out of district placements and put it into their own schools. Okay, jumping ahead. So let's go to the next slide. Here's one that some of you may have experienced firsthand, and it's the fifth flaw in LRE, is that IEP teams seem to think that a more restrictive placement guarantees a greater intensity of supports in services. And the slide uses the term conflate. IEP teams conflate placement with the location and intensity of supports and services. There is absolutely no reason why the same supports and services being offered in a special ed classroom cannot be brought into a general ed classroom. I've seen it work. I mean, and sometimes when I do workshops, I talk about District A and District B. They're 10 miles apart in geography. In District A, a student who has what I consider very minimal support needs is still recommended for a self-contained classroom, where in the district right next door, a student who requires lots of adaptive equipment, lots of technology, lots of specialized instruction is still successfully placed in general education. So we need to change how people have those placement deliberations and not fall into the trap of thinking that intensity means segregation. Okay. And number 6. I can stop my little tremor. Okay. The LRE principle, which sanctions, in other words, it in certain cases says it's okay for students to be segregated. That really discourages schools from making improvements in instruction in general ed by focusing, again, this ableism thing, focusing on identifying and remediating perceived deficits in students' functional performance. If, in fact, there were, I don't know, more penalties or, for segregated placements or more incentive for inclusive placements, then maybe what teams would do is they would come to the IEP meeting or they would, say, we really are making way too many placements in self-contained classrooms. we must not be doing a very good job of universally designed instruction. Let's see if we improve the flexibility and the accessibility of our instruction and our materials in general ed. And maybe, lo and behold, we'll think that more students with disabilities fit nicely into that general ed classroom. That's kind of a dream of mine. All right, what can we do? What can we do? Well, this slide is the what can we do in an ideal world when we all can devote all of our time and energy to making policy change. I'm envisioning a unified system that really brings together under one umbrella education for all students, students with and without disabilities. I envision a law, let's call it the Inclusive Elementary and Secondary Education Act, where the rights and the protections that are available to students with disabilities are included in this law, but where all classrooms are inclusive classrooms, all classrooms are able to access all the expertise, all general ed classrooms, sorry, are able to um, seek out the expertise from all the really smart people in the building. So the special ed teachers, the behavior specialists, the paraeducators, the speech pathologists, the OTs, I mean, the reading specialists, everybody just pours their heart and soul into those general ed classrooms. Um, and, and there's no reason to think about a segregated environment for any student. I realize that is a tall order. And every time I bring up this idea of, well, why can't we? Why can't we work with our legislators to think about a radical education reform? I'm told that, and particularly families and advocates for students with disabilities are really worried that they're going to lose something rather than gain something. So any kind of a push or a dream towards this unified system would have to really think about how to protect people's rights. But on a more practical basis, let's go to the next slide and talk about what you can do, whether you're an educator, whether you are a parent. So here's a few suggestions. Educate yourself. Um, Read the case law. There's a wonderful resource available for families and educators called the TIES Center. And I'm sure Charmaine will put up a link to it, TIES at the University of Minnesota. You know, your inclusive 101 PhD, you could get that by going to the TIES Center and reading all their wonderful materials and watching their webinars. Run for school board. That's one of my favorite ones. In New Hampshire, some of the most important changes for students and adults with developmental disabilities have come because empowered families have gotten a place on their local school board or even on their state board of education. Number 3, start an inclusive education task force in your school. Recruit like-minded parents, like-minded educators to become a group of people that is always more powerful than one lone voice, a group of people that works with your school district to improve inclusion for all students. If people want to email me, I have multi-page documents that I've prepared for schools about how the workings of such an inclusive education task force could kind of organize itself. I would be happy. I will take the identifying information off those reports and would be happy to send you one. I've got a sample one for elementary schools, sample one for high school. Recommendation 4, start early. If you are a parent or an educator, advocate for those inclusive preschool placements because a couple of successful years in an inclusive preschool environment, whether that's an inclusive school district preschool, a Head Start, a private community preschool, that is a very powerful data set to bring with you when kindergarten IEP comes around. When that preschool teacher can say, we've loved having Jerome in our class. Um, Number 5, for families in particular, IEP meetings are brutal. Even when I go as an expert, I'm shaking all over. So, parent, bring a knowledgeable parent, a friend with you, or an advocate to an IEP meeting. And if you're overwhelmed, by the time you get to the topic of placement, you can always ask to adjourn the meeting, to have a little, a few days to compose yourself and your arguments, and then resume. So take a deep breath, and certainly, reach out to advocates like Charmaine, who are available all across the country. And with more things happening by remote, they may not even have to travel to your location to be able to help you. So, shall we take?
Yes, I just want to. Oops, I missed your last slide there.
Oh,
Um,
if not now, when? If not us, who?
exactly. And here's Cheryl's website that you can go to, and there's a form on there where you can connect with her. And I would just like to say that this has been a wonderful hour, and we've had several comments that they would love us to have a second hour. So I told Cheryl earlier, if she's willing, we would love for her to come back. And if you agree, give me a in the comments, because we know that we have more work to do, and that when our circle of allies is widened, that we can have much more impact. I did want to bring up Ricky's comment here, because I also hear that a lot from families. And she said, aren't these more flaws with implementation than with actual LRE provision? There are groups who would like to get rid of the LRE provisions who may misunderstand that is what parents want instead of needing tweaks and improved implementation and monitoring. So if you can talk about implementation rather than the provision, the principle of LRE.
I wish it were the case that all we needed was better implementation and monitoring. I was telling Charmaine before we went live that back in the late 80s and early 90s, there were many states that received federal grants called statewide systems change grants. And they were specifically related to the integration of students with significant disabilities in general ed. During those years that those grants were in operation, and I can name you the school districts in New Hampshire, we made tremendous progress. In increasing our percentage of students in general education. When that level of intensive technical assistance and support and training and improved implementation and monitoring went away, what was left? And that is the law was left. The LRE provisions of the law that still don't do enough to even out practices across states. They don't do enough to sort of provide enough professional development to folks so that they understand how specialized instruction can be provided within a general ed class. We've definitely not had enough training or widespread implementation of the ideas behind universal design for learning. So I wish, I mean, I've done it for 36 years. I wish it was just improving what we already have that would make a difference, but I've just not seen that to be effective on a large scale.
Right.
Can you know, committed and smart parents and, you know, welcoming and committed educators make a difference for individual students here and there, or even individual schools here and there? Absolutely. I can point to some really nicely inclusive schools around the country. But if we look at the data, it's not changing significantly enough to make that 17% grow over time. I see an interesting question from Laura, Laura Vecchio McCaskill. What about alternative curriculum?
Oh,
So, all of you smart parents and educators know that there is something called the alternate assessment, which is for students who have a label of the most significant cognitive disability. That alternate assessment is actually not an alternative curriculum. What the alternate assessment and the standards that the alternate assessment measures, they're the same standards as the general ed standards, but they're just um, decreased in depth, breadth, and complexity. So if you go on your State Department's website and look up, you know, New Jersey alternate assessment, you'll be able to find, I would imagine, because I've seen a dozen of them, a document that lines up the alternate assessment standards with the general assessment standards. If you could bring that document to an IEP meeting and say, well, I understand that one of the things that they teach in fourth grade is an understanding of how population migration led to blah blah, I don't know, something. And then you could say, look, the alternate assessment standard really relates to that same thing, but it just isn't at the same level of rigor. So when the teacher is teaching that thing about, you know, population migration, my student can be part of that. And maybe my students' learning objectives could be understanding that people move from place to place, being able to plot migration from New Jersey to Idaho. Maybe my student who takes that alternate assessment doesn't really need an alternate curriculum. They just need a classroom teacher, just who is able, who is welcoming to the idea that all students in her class may not leave knowing the exact same thing, but they'll all leave knowing kind of the same big ideas, some of the basic concepts, some of the most important people in that history lesson. And the I think the book that I wrote, It's More Than Just Being In, gives several examples of how students who have that label of most significant cognitive disability can still work towards learning objectives that are very much related to what's going on in general ed classroom, in the general ed classroom, and achieve their IEP skills.
right. And that, you know, the other thing I think about is the statistics that local school districts report to their State Department of Ed, that their State Department of Ed reports to the U.S. Department of Ed, you know, as far as how many students are participating in general ed. Well, actually, you know, it's how many students have checked that box that they're in general ed. And so then it's like, yes, but how many of our kids are, you know, again, Michael Giangreco's The Island in the Mainstream cartoon comes up in my mind, are sitting in the back of the room still, you know, working on something totally different. Or they might be, you know, sitting at a table with a group of students, but not actively participating or learning. And so just the mere statistic that kids are included doesn't really show the whole picture, right?
That's right.
I mean, it's really, uh, kind of incredible when you look at the amount of work that still needs to be done. And I love the specific examples that Cheryl shared with us, because I really think it's going to take that grassroots effort, but also the top down. I know in our Trailblazer group, we listened to a part of a webinar that Carol from Maryland, now I can't think, yes, Quirk just did, well, a few months ago. But when she was talking, she was saying she really felt like if the superintendent had those leadership qualities, that was going to make such a big difference in the school. And I see it as we've got to do the grassroots, we've got to have the top down. And you look at states like the state of Washington now, because of the extra funding and the specific projects that are going on, it is like exploding with wonderful possibilities. And my fear is what happens when that goes away, right? And how much of that gets translated.
Yeah.
But another interesting comment that Carol made was she felt like it was really important for teachers and parents to actually go to some of, like maybe a Swift demonstration site, or, a school that other people have been consulting with. So do you know, Cheryl, is there a way that we could, if it's not there, compile, not you and I, somebody else, compile a list of schools that people actually could go and visit and see it in progress?
We want that. We've wanted that list for a long time. What Unfortunately, right now, I worry that what's going to happen is that those schools will get overcrowded,
Right.
with families and students who, like, everybody can't go to the Henderson School in Boston. Not
Right.
everybody can afford to live in the area. And, they only have so many kids they can have in their building. What I think is a better route to have that same outcome would be for families and educators to get in touch with people in their own state who may have that more up to date and more geographically accessible information. So, if you have a Down syndrome parent group, the ARC, again, it used to stand for something, doesn't anymore. If you have a member of TASH, if you can go on the site of the Coalition of Parent Advocates and Attorneys, find an advocate in your state who knows kind of the lay of the land. I think that's a better way to connect people. But I absolutely agree that seeing it in person. There are a couple of folks on your chat list who just kind of can't imagine that students with the most significant disabilities can be included, and I think it would be very helpful to go on a little field trip, see what that looks like.
Yes, yes.
Yeah,
And I think
go ahead.
I was going to say some of Dan Habib's films also are helpful, because, he's done the video of the actual class participation. So that could be another resource that I put in there for people.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, and I think you can go to the Swift Schools website and find out who their who their knowledge development schools were, which are those kind of model schools that they learned from to do their work.
Right, right. We are at the top of the hour, and we have so many wonderful comments and questions that we can't get to. I will come back later and do some responding. And Cheryl, if you have time, I'm sure people would appreciate that. Before I say goodbye and before I forget, you have a choice, people. You can either win the Beyond Access model from Cheryl, or it's more than just being in. And so what I'm going to do is a very scientific way. I close my eyes and scroll up and down the comments, and I stop on somebody, and that will be the lucky winner. And since we like choice, we will give you a choice of the book you win. So, who do we have? Terry. So, you are our lucky winner. If you can message me and let me know which book of Cheryl's you would like. Um, and maybe we'll close with her comment. She said, I find when talking and listening to parents who prefer a segregated setting, it's often more of a fear of how their student will be mistreated as part of the general ed class, and they are not wrong for having that fear, which brings up another conversation I've had in the past, and I can link that as far as cameras in classrooms. I know that has been a topic among teachers. But yeah, that fear of, especially I think when if your child is nonverbal and can't come home and talk about what's happened. And those are real fears that we need to address. And it's not like we're saying, just skim over those. Those are realities that we certainly need to address. But Cheryl, I just, we could make this a day-long marathon. We could splice a bunch of videos together and people could just binge on watching you this weekend. But thank you so much for being here with us today and for being persistent and knowing that there are so many more possibilities for disabled students and students with disabilities. And we need to gather strong efforts to make that change happen. And so, do you have any final words of wisdom for us, Cheryl?
I guess I'd say it's worth it. It's
Thank
worth
you.
the struggle. It's worth the work. And find allies. That's the other thing. I can't imagine being the lone voice out there, whether you're a parent or an educator. Find allies, and it's worth it.
Yes, for sure. Well, thank you so much. And thank everyone for being here. You can share this link so friends that weren't able to be here with us live can watch the replay. Like I said, I'll be emailing out all the wonderful things that we've talked about today and the different resources. So if you're not on my list, you can sign up because this is going to be one section of the show notes that's going to be really packed with wonderful, valuable tips that we got today. So next week, I want to remind people that we are having a guest from Seattle, Shelly Johnson, and she was actually in our chat today. She is a parent, has a son with Down syndrome, and also is a life coach and mindfulness coach. And she's going to come on next Thursday and talk about de-stressing, with all the holiday stress and beyond. And she's going to actually lead us through some actual kind of mindful exercises that we can do to de-stress. So we might need Shelly to come on each week because it can be a stressful time for all of us, right? But thank you again so much, Cheryl. I hope people will connect with you and I know that you will keep on keeping on, right?
And thank you, Charmaine. Again, anytime we can bring people, like-minded people together, we all leave a little bit more powerful.
Yes.
Great.
Thank you. All right. Goodbye, everybody, and we shall see you. Oops, my alarm's going off. That's official. We're